say welcome to the Stress Management and Self-Care webinar. I'm Carolyn Beneglauda, and I'm introducing Karla Vermeulen from the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at SUNY New Paltz. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in disaster mental health, grief counseling, and lifespan developmental psychology, among other topics. She's been kind enough to spend this hour and a half with us today and to share her expertise in this field. Before we begin, I want to give you an introduction to our virtual space. We are using Zoom webinar, which is slightly different than the Zoom meetings that many of you have grown intimately familiar with in the past 2 months. The big difference is that you cannot see the other attendees, and you won't have your own video and your own sound enabled. Only the panelists have microphone and video enabled. And with that in mind, in order to participate in this webinar, there are 2 functions available to you at the bottom of your Zoom screen. One is the Q&A, which you can use if you have something specific you want to ask our presenter today. We'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation for questions that weren't addressed during the course of Karla's talk. The other feature, which I think a lot of you have discovered in order to say hello, is chat, and that's where you can have a conversation. So one thing to note with these features, your name, as you can see, will be linked to your question or comment, and you can also choose to chat anonymously. We're going to trust that you will conduct yourselves in a way that is courteous to fellow attendees, but anyone who uses chat in an abusive or threatening way will be removed from the webinar. Other than that, the software does not allow you to see the names of other attendees. So with that in mind, I just want to take a minute to let you know about the makeup of today's audience. So there were over 500 people who signed up for this webinar today, and you come from all over New York State, from Long Island to Buffalo, the far reaches of the North Country, and the Southern Tier. This webinar is being produced by Southeastern, and we represent the 8 counties that make up the Hudson Valley. The people attending come from all library types. So we have academics, public, school, and special libraries, including hospital libraries and cultural heritage institutions. We also have representations from different kinds of library workers, including, but not limited to, clerks, catalogers, reference librarians, administrators, and directors. So I have 2 short reminders before I turn the controls over to Karla. One is that, as you just saw, we will be recording this webinar, and we'll make it available to you later in case you need to step away for a bit. The other is that we have CE certificates available to anyone attending who needs them. I'll drop a link in the chat to the request form that you can fill out, and we will send you the certificate upon request. And we will also, at the end of the webinar, give you a link to the evaluation. So with all of that being said, I want to thank you again for being here with us today and for all the work that you're doing to keep libraries vital and relevant while we navigate these uncertain waters. And we truly appreciate your work. So Karla, I'm going to turn it over to you. Okay. I'm going to stop my share.
Okay.
And
okay, is that working?
I see it.
Okay, great. Okay, hopefully everything's all set. Yes, and let me just acknowledge this is my first time presenting using this version of Zoom as well. So if I'm fumbling a little bit, please everyone be tolerant of that. So yeah, thank you, Carolyn. Thank you to all of you who are making time for this. I'm sure everyone's super busy, but I think we can all hopefully agree this is a topic that is pretty relevant right now. And I want to start, and I hope this doesn't seem like pandering because I mean it totally sincerely. I'm a huge fan of libraries. They were a tremendous part of my childhood, certainly since I've become an academic. So I love libraries. If I have time at the end, I'll tell you about the time last year when I got deputized to be in charge of one for 10 minutes in a tiny little 1-room library in Maine. It was very exciting, but I don't want to, I'll save that if there's time at the end. But again, I'm a huge fan of your work because libraries have meant so much to me personally. I also recognize that for me, they've been gravy, they've been a luxury, they've been an awesome thing that I've been privileged to have access to. They're not a lifeline for me like they are for a lot of the patrons that I know you guys are dealing with and struggling, I'm sure, to keep providing that lifeline under these circumstances. So I just wanted to start off by acknowledging, I think everyone's probably dealing with different forms of stress, and I'm going to talk about kind of what are typical stress reactions and what we can do about them. Whoops, yeah. There we go. Okay, so just the topics I'm going to cover, and hopefully this will be about an hour for the actual training portion, and then we'll have plenty of time, I hope, for question and answer at the end. But I'll talk some about just typical stress reactions, and then some about the COVID-19 specific issues that everyone's grappling with to some degree or another, some basic stress management techniques. And then I'm going to spend a bunch of time talking about this method called stress inoculation, which is a more sort of cognitive approach to dealing with stress. And I think it's very sort of under-recognized, and I personally find it very helpful. So I hope that will be useful. A lot of what I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation is more dealing with your own needs. And then we're going to have kind of a companion webcast 2 weeks from today, which my colleague, the IDMH director, Dr. Amy Nitze, is going to be presenting on psychological first aid. So that's more basic skills you can use to support other people dealing with stress. It very much kind of complements this, but in talking with Carolyn and Tessa and planning this, we thought, like, first let's deal with ourselves. I mean, it's such a tired cliche, the whole like put your oxygen mask on before helping others, but it really is the case. I mean, if you are not taking care of yourself, you can't function professionally or personally or anything like that. So I'll focus more on your own issues, but of course that kind of has a ripple effect for dealing with everyone else as well. I should just also mention, I am not monitoring the chat or the Q&A while I'm doing this, so I don't get overly distracted by that, but Carolyn's going to jump in if there are any sort of questions that are very timely along the way or anything people think should be clarified. Otherwise, we will have a Q&A at the end where we'll get to those. All right, so understanding stress. I know we can do like polls and these things. I always joke, like, I could do a poll of asking it, how many of you are dealing with stress in your lives right now, but I think the response rate would be 100%, so I didn't bother doing that. But I think it's useful, even though we all are familiar with the experience of stress, to sort of step back and take a look at why we're feeling the way we are feeling, why other people under stress are acting the way they are acting. So personally, I find that kind of useful. So we'll do a little bit of a look at that. All right, so to begin with, can people see my whole, I'm going to assume you can see the full slides. I want to differentiate a little bit between trauma and stress and kind of crisis as this middle ground. You know, my organization is the Institute for Disaster Mental Health. So a lot of what we normally focus on is more kind of acute stressful events that people can go through. So things like disasters, or that could be something like serious illness or being in a motor vehicle accident or the victim of a crime or something like that. So that's kind of the traditional definition of trauma, where something big happens and that's all it takes to cause a significant response. But I think especially in these times, we also want to recognize that there's this kind of bigger background picture of stress, which then can easily kind of merge into a more acute sense of crisis, which then can merge into a sense of trauma. And that's especially true when we're looking at kind of all of these multiple stressors everyone's dealing with, which also reinforces why it's so important to try and address that stress before it turns into a situation of crisis or trauma. So, but kind of differentiating, you know, we're all sort of dealing with this bigger picture, which is a little bit different, but interconnected with more specific types of trauma. So just a few definitions of different kinds of stress. I mean, basically we can think of stress as what is our evolutionarily developed response to any demand for change, any pressure, any situation that we might perceive as a threat or something that, you know, causes us to take some response above and beyond our normal functioning. And I think it's useful just to remember that there are these different kinds of stressors. So this idea of acute stress, that really is what we did evolve to cope with. So that's, you know, you're living your life, or you're functioning at your baseline, whatever that might be. Something happens that you have to respond to. And that is what activates the fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system arousal reaction. We respond to it in whatever way is necessary, and then hopefully it gets resolved and we're able to come back to that baseline level. That's good. I mean, that's not easy, but that's kind of what we're best equipped to be dealing with. A little more challenging, or often considerably more challenging, to be dealing with more chronic forms of stress. So this is just kind of that stuff that's in the background all the time and, kind of ebbs and flows to some degree, but it's always there to some extent. And I think modern life, even pre-pandemic, so many of us have just kind of gotten into this state where we're expecting to live under conditions of chronic stress. That is particularly true for people living in poverty or in situations where they're exposed to neighborhood violence, or they're undocumented immigrants or anything like that, or substance abuse issues, which I'm guessing might be the case for a lot of the patrons that you're dealing with on a regular basis. So that stuff makes your baseline kind of higher than ideal, and you don't kind of have that chance to come back down from that. So that's problematic. I'm sure we're all aware of the health issues that can come up. I mean, higher rates of cardiovascular issues, hypertension, diabetes, things that are directly coming out of, even if it's more psychological stress, it takes a physical toll as well. And then there's more that level of traumatic stress, more like what I was talking about before. So a disaster. And I mean, what's tricky right now is we're all kind of dealing with all three forms of this, I think. So what's happening basically, come back to that, is, whoops, wrong way. We're sort of dealing with all of these different forms of stress to some degree or another, and we're just not adapted to kind of be able to function with that. So I think that's why everyone is feeling like our stress levels are, here rather than here, and sometimes they're here. So that's why this is even more important than under normal circumstances. So that said, I also want to acknowledge that not all stress is bad. There's this idea of eustress, like positive stress. This is the good stuff. I mean, this is the things that motivate us, that challenge us, that make us push ourselves. So if we didn't have any stress at all in our lives, we wouldn't really have much reason to get out of bed in the morning or to try or to keep functioning. So I think that's, a good thing to remember. And I'm going to come back to this point, but this idea that, there's this inverted U-shaped curve where there's kind of this optimal level of eustress in the middle, where it's positive, it's exciting, it's challenging, it's a good form of that, but it's very easy for that to tip over into the distress side. And especially, when we do have this chronic on acute kind of stressors that we're all dealing with now. So just a few general points about these reactions. First of all, these make sense. I mean, these are not pathological. These are not disordered. This is the reality of trying to cope with all of these new difficult situations that are being pushed into our faces in any kind of stress, let alone the current pandemic situation. So that doesn't mean they're fun. It doesn't mean they're pleasant. It just means they make sense. It also is good to note that sometimes we recognize when we're feeling stressed. Something happens, we get the latest piece of news or the latest job situation, or we're doing a presentation to, I don't even know how many participants, I don't want to know right now. But you have, something happens, you have that immediate response. Other times it's more delayed. Sometimes people are almost not even connecting the reaction they're having to the actual stressor. So sometimes just kind of stopping and thinking, okay, why am I feeling this way? What is it? Because that's sort of the first step towards actually being able to do something about it. Then, especially when we're looking at more acute stressors or including those more traumatic stressors, these reactions do tend to change over time. So, especially when we're looking at people who have been through a disaster, we always educate that almost everyone who goes through something difficult will have post-traumatic stress reactions, but that is not the same as post-traumatic stress disorder. For most people, when things start to stabilize again, they can reactivate their normal coping, their normal resilience. Generally, that's going to improve over time, and most people are not going to need professional mental health assistance. However, that's a little bit different now because we just don't have an understanding of the timing of this particular stressor that we're all going through. So I'll return to that in a moment. And then last point here is this idea that stress reactions occur across multiple realms. So what are those realms? We tend to think most automatically of the emotional ones. And even within just thinking about emotions, these can vary tremendously. So I tend to think of these as internalizing versus externalizing. So sometimes we're feeling anxious or depressed or sad or vulnerable. So it's more kind of, you know, we're withdrawing within ourselves with these feelings. Sometimes it's more, we're angry, irritable, lashing out. So it's that more kind of outward facing form of feeling these emotions. And some people tend to go towards one side or the other of those generally, or we also can kind of bounce back and forth between them. So one moment you're feeling depressed and withdrawn, and the next moment you're wanting to shout at your children or whoever. So that's, you know, that can make people feel very destabilized, just that kind of variability in itself. We also often carry our stress physically. You know, I talked about things like diseases developing out of chronic exposure to stress, but I'm sure we all have that kind of tell. Like for me, it's, you know, my jaw is clenched or my neck is stiff. We all have a particular way of carrying our stress physically. And so that's important to recognize. Also that for some cultures, it's more acceptable to acknowledge a physical reaction than an emotional one. So someone might be telling you, you know, my stomach really hurts. And that's their way of saying, I'm really distressed, but it's not okay to say I'm distressed. Also, these reactions can impact our behaviors. And here again, some people kind of withdraw and pull away or try to avoid the situation that's going on. Others kind of want to reach out, they're needy, they don't want to be left alone. And of course, self-medicating, which that's just a way, I mean, I say alcohol or drugs, that could also be binge eating, overeating, or smoking or whatever. Those are basically ways of numbing what we're feeling and trying to get away from them, which can, of course, I'm sure we're all aware, quickly become pretty problematic. There's also often these cognitive reactions, and people often don't even realize that these are stress reactions. We hear this all the time, and I'm sure, you know, people are talking about quarantine brain right now. This is a stress reaction. That idea that you can't concentrate, you're preoccupied, you can't remember anything, you can't get anything accomplished. That is a stress reaction, pure and simple. And so recognizing it as such, maybe it will help us not judge ourselves quite as extremely as a lot of us have been doing. And then the idea of spiritual reactions, that tends to be more in response to something like a more traumatic experience, but I would certainly count the pandemic in that category. Some people experience an increase in faith when they go through something really difficult. You know, this is God's will, God has a plan, God will take care of us, or whatever your deity or higher power is. But in many cases, it causes real questioning. How could God have let this happen? That's a question we hear after disasters all the time. There's no good answer to that. But I think it's important to recognize for people who are feeling that, that's a real second blow. You know, this idea that not only did this awful thing happen to me or my community or my family, but the higher power I believe in could have prevented this. And so there's that kind of loss in faith or loss in that sense of benevolence, which can be really, really troubling for people as well. And then these are, you know, more likely related to something around, again, more of a disaster rather than more kind of chronic sources of stress. But these ideas of shame and guilt are super powerful. There are different definitions or ways people break these two down. I tend to think of it in the sense that shame is more, I am flawed. There's just something intrinsically wrong with me as a human being. Whereas guilt is a little more, I did something wrong or I didn't do something I should have done. But even that can be extremely powerful, you know, especially for responders, carers. And I would say pretty much at this point, we are all responders in some capacity. That idea of performance guilt or guilt due to absence, you know, we can always identify something we could have done differently. If only I had been able to go to work that day, I could have prevented this. If only I had done something better. Often there's a lot of cognitive distortion with those. People have really unrealistic ideas about what they might have done. So sometimes, even for ourselves, we can sort of talk ourselves down from at least the distortions or the non-reality based part of that. Yes, we can always think of something we could have done better or differently, but we were functioning with the best information we had or the best options we had at the time. So forgiving ourselves for that. And then in this case with the pandemic, there's this other very unusual type of guilt, of this fear that maybe we have been infected and we are exposing other people unintentionally. So that kind of adds a whole new ripple to this idea of guilt. So those are all kind of the common typical reactions to stress across these different realms. And I think just being conscious of them, labeling them, recognizing when you have that headache you can't get rid of, or you can't remember anything, attaching it to the stress, at least as a way of not thinking I'm going crazy or I'm always going to feel like this. Because if you don't do that, you can't start to figure out how to deal with it. All right, so looking at some of the more outbreak specific issues. And these are going to be different for every individual. So, I mean, I guess I encourage you while I'm going through these, think about which of these apply to you, think about which apply to the patrons you're trying to help, to your own family members, your community, et cetera. But, this is by no means a comprehensive list, but the next few slides are kind of some of the main issues that we've identified as likely to be troubling people. All right, so first of all, this idea that this comes up in any kind of infectious disease outbreak. Just that fear that we don't know if we've been exposed. And especially, now there's a better sense of how long the incubation period is likely to be, but especially at the beginning of this, when, what it was like 2 days to 2 weeks. 2 weeks is a very long time to be worried about whether you've been exposed to something that's going to make you sick. So that's very difficult. And it's just, I mean, I can't think of a better word for this than it's just creepy to think that we've taken something into our bodies that might cause us harm, or even if it doesn't cause us that degree of harm, as I said before, that we might be exposing other people. So that's incredibly stressful for people. Then, we just don't know what the longer term impact is going to be. This is one of the real differences from more traditional disasters, where the event happens and then it's over, and then you begin the recovery process from it. And that recovery might be long lasting and incredibly difficult and stressful and traumatizing and all of that. But generally, the extent of the harm that you have suffered. And so then you can start to work on accepting that and moving on. In this case, we can't do that. We're in this kind of weird state where we're in the before, during, and after all simultaneously. So that's proving incredibly hard for people to deal with. And unfortunately, the social distancing, as much as that has proven to be reasonably effective in terms of flattening the curve and all of that good stuff that we all want to be doing, it's also problematic because if there's anything we know, it's that reaching out to our sources of social support is the best cure or the best remedy for stress and uncertainty. And unfortunately, we're not able to do that, at least in a physical way right now. So that is clearly compounding stress for a lot of people. I mean, it's great we have the technology like this that we can use to stay connected, and we can have video calls with our families who we're separated from and stuff like that, but it's not the same. I think we all can agree. And then just adding fuel to all of these existing fires, the state of information. I mean, you are all information specialists, so you understand the importance of accurate, credible, reliable information, and also the consequences of when that is not available. Now, some of the uncertainty, some of the lack of reliable information is unavoidable just because, it's a changing situation. We're learning more about how the virus actually functions and how to treat it. Some of that is natural, but of course now that's being compounded by the conflicting messaging, let's say, we are receiving from different authorities. And then of course, you have confirmation bias, where now you can, on the internet and social media, you can find someone who's going to reinforce the version of this story that you want to be hearing. So then that just kind of polarizes people in terms of the messages that they are actually absorbing and following. So that's a big problem. So this, I mean, I kind of alluded to this before, but what this means, because this is all changing and there is all of that uncertainty, and none of us have been through something like this before, that means we get, something happens, we get the latest piece of news, and in my experience at least, rather than, okay, I get the latest news about social distancing or whatever the next policy is going to be, rather than coming back to my previous baseline, my baseline comes up to where I was with that latest piece of news. So it's like this constant ratcheting up. And I don't know how we're going to kind of get back to what was already for many of us a not that healthy level of baseline stress to begin with. So I'm probably depressing everyone. Sorry about that, but I think it's good to at least recognize this and put language to it and be able to kind of name it. So some of the other stressors that people are certainly dealing with, obviously the medical fears. Fears about becoming sick ourselves, that fear I keep talking about, what if I'm infected but asymptomatic and spreading it to other people? Then the fear about our loved ones, certainly, you know, especially for people who have children who it seems like are largely not getting this badly, although now there's this weird syndrome that's going on. I have elderly parents. They're certainly my main source of concern through all of this in terms of the physical risks. And then caregivers. I mean, probably almost everyone has some form of dependents who are relying on them. And so what will happen to you if you get sick? What, you know, who will take care of your dependents? Who will take care of you if they are not able to do that sufficiently? And then if they get sick, how are you going to be able to take care of them while still trying to do your jobs and all of the other issues? So obviously the, you know, the physical stuff and the caregiving are essential concerns. And there's all this other stuff as well, just because of the uncertainty of this, that, you know, we don't have precedents, we don't have practices for coming out of a pandemic, at least not within the last 100 years or so. So some of the concerns, I keep joking about this, even though it's very true. How many have thought this much about toilet paper throughout the rest of our lives, as we all have been doing in the last 6 weeks or so? But it's not just toilet paper, it's other groceries, it's diapers, it's medications that are unrelated to COVID-19, other healthcare resources. What happens if a family member gets sick with something else and has to go into the hospital? You know, but all of these concerns related to that. The impact on children's education. I mean, I'm sure as librarians, everyone's deeply concerned with that issue, whether or not you work with children or not. But, you know, impact on education. I'm concerned about the impact on my college students' education. I mean, they are not having a good semester. They are not learning what they're supposed to, but even worse, of course, for younger children. So that's obviously a big juggling act and source of stress and concern for parents and everyone else. Jobs, I'll come back to that in a moment, but obviously that's, you know, tremendous number of people are unemployed now. And so people who already may be marginal to begin with, they're tipped over into destitution or you know, extreme need. And then there's just going to be a bunch of other individual ones, just depending on your own personal circumstances. So social concerns. I mean, I keep wondering, what is this going to be like when this is over? How many people are developing agoraphobia and germophobia? I can never remember what the proper name for that is. How are we going to be comfortable going out to the grocery store again, or even just being in public unmasked again? And then issues around, you know, we've largely people have sort of come together and had that, you know, US strong kind of, we'll get through it together, but not helping that this is going on during a presidential election. So certainly partisan issues that are getting fueled by this. These concerns around hoarding, competition. I talked about the social distancing. And this last point is so poignant. You know, for us, this was supposed to be the last week of classes. I know those in K through 12, you still got a few more weeks to go, but most of my students this semester are seniors, and they are not getting all of the end of college experiences they're supposed to. They're not going to have a live commencement ceremony for another year. Others are missing things like your friend's birthday parties, or, you know, these are real losses. I mean, no, these are not losses like having someone in your family die, for sure, but they're genuine losses. And I think we need to recognize that, especially for younger people. You know, adults, we can have the sense like, okay, it's terrible, you know, we missed our, I don't know what, anniversary this year, but we'll be able to celebrate that in the future. Kids don't have that perspective. You know, this was the one prom they were going to have, the one graduation they were going to have. And so we really need to give them the permission to mourn that, and to mourn that those experiences ourselves. And we don't have rituals for that. You know, people are trying to develop alternative ways to mark these events, but it's just not the same. Economic concerns, I mentioned this briefly before, you know, millions and millions, I think what, it's up to 10 million people now on unemployment. I mean, truly, truly record-breaking numbers. Even for people who are sort of holding on, how long are they going to be able to do that? Again, thinking about my students graduating into this economy, you know, they may never quite get back on track the way that the kids who graduated in the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009 kind of started off on this bad trajectory. So whatever stage of life people are in, this is obviously a huge, huge issue for them. For those of us who are fortunate enough to still have jobs, which clearly, at least at this point, does apply to everyone in this audience and to myself, that's great. You know, I think hopefully we're all appreciative of that, but that doesn't mean we're not dealing with our own stressors as well. So anyone who's actually out there, you know, whether they're working in the grocery store or the hospital or as a home healthcare aide or a delivery person, whatever, how do they kind of keep doing their jobs while dealing with the anxiety and stress about whether they're going to get exposed? So that, you know, they are heroes for sure. I wish they could all get combat pay and guaranteed vacations when this is all over. Anyone who is dealing with young children, I don't have to say anymore, you know how stressful that is. Having that idea of boundaries, you know, how many of us are now feeling like the workday never ends? You know, because your office is now in your living room or your bedroom, how do you kind of say, okay, that's it, it's the end of the day, especially when we might be dealing with crises and emergencies coming up all the time. So I'm not doing a good job at that myself, I will acknowledge that. And then for anyone who's a supervisor, who's a boss, how can you kind of keep your team going while they are trying to work remotely, and find that balance of being supportive and understanding and having standards that are good enough while not letting all standards go entirely, because you have to keep some level of productivity so that you can keep your jobs and keep your businesses going and all of that. So those are all kind of some of the most pressing forms of stress, you know, both in general and then the outbreak related ones. Obviously there are more. I'm sure you've all been, you know, thinking, well, she didn't talk about this because we all do have our own kind of combination of these factors. But so what do we do about it? This, you know, I always kind of joke, especially for mental health professionals, you know, we always talk about the need for self-care. I'm going to frame this next section as, even if you don't think of yourselves as mental health helpers or in the caring professions, you absolutely are. So you should be thinking of yourselves that way, because you are dealing with clients, you are dealing with human beings. And so for all of this, we need to get beyond the sense of paying lip service to it, it's, you know, it's often seen as that thing that, like, yeah, if I have time at the end of the day, I'll deal with that. And then of course we never do. So getting better at that is absolutely essential. So I'll spend the next few slides on that before I get into stress inoculation. So this is, we being IDMH, the royal we, describe this as the self-care imperative, this idea, this reality that it is not a luxury to take care of ourselves. It is an ethical responsibility because there are people counting on us, and we have ethical obligations to them to take care of them the best that we possibly can. And as I said before, with the very tired oxygen mask analogy, if we're not doing that, then we are not going to be able to continue. We're going to burn out ourselves, and then we're not going to be helpful for anyone. So please just try and take this seriously, because now more than ever, this is really relevant. And I think another point to keep in mind is, you know, we keep referring or keep reminding ourselves that this whole pandemic, the response to it is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And it's gonna be, I think, like one of those ultra marathons ultimately, because we're in the marathon we're in right now. And then when things start opening up again, we're gonna be in a different kind of marathon as we all adapt to that. And then as things start to normalize, whatever that's going to mean again, that's going to be a different kind of marathon. So we really have to take this seriously. All right, enough preaching on that. So this is something that we often talk about, especially in educating counselors or other mental health people, but this idea of the compassion stress continuum. And this is the idea that hopefully we all got into this field, whatever your particular field is, your helping, caring field, because you genuinely are compassionate, because you are a helpful person, because you want to do things that benefit other people. However, we need to recognize that as much as there are rewards for doing that, this compassion satisfaction, it's also very easy to slip into this idea of compassion fatigue. So what do we mean by both of these points on this continuum? So compassion satisfaction is this idea of, the rewards that we do get when we are doing the work that we feel we're meant to be doing, that we're called to be doing. So that includes feeling that sense of accomplishment and purpose, and that you have abilities, that you are competent. Those are really good feelings. And I want to go back to that idea of eustress, of the positive stress that I talked about earlier, because sometimes when you are doing the work that is most satisfying and most rewarding, that can involve a lot of stress. I mean, that is the idea where you're pushing yourself, where you are learning new skills, where you are taking on new challenges. And so, it's important not to think that having compassion satisfaction means living a stress-free existence. It absolutely doesn't, but it is a matter of keeping that stress manageable and doing what you need to do to keep it in that, that apex, yeah, I guess, of the inverted U, where it's the positive side of that stress and it's not tipping over into the negative side. So just a nice kind of handy tool that we often use in trainings, this ProQual. It's just a little self-assessment survey that you can download at this website. It's the Professional Quality of Life instrument. And it's just a way of kind of assessing how much satisfaction, how much compassion fatigue, and how much burnout you're getting from different aspects of your job. A way to sort of just very quickly kind of quantify what you sort of intuitively know you're feeling. So that's a nice tool if you want to have a little kind of check-in with that. But it is just, again, kind of thinking about, am I getting that satisfaction? How do I keep it on that side of the continuum? Because obviously, if we're tipping over onto the compassion fatigue side, that's when we can't keep going. So I'll talk about burnout in a second. I think people get into very elaborate distinctions between those two. To me, compassion fatigue is sort of a helping specific form of burnout, which comes from just giving too much. Your job requires you to put yourself out there to care for other people. And if you're not taking care of yourself, or there are just, an overwhelming number of pressures on you, it's pretty easy to get into this point where you've just given too much, you have nothing left in the tank. So that's kind of compassion fatigue in terms of overextending your selflessness or your helping of others. And that can be particularly challenging for people who think of themselves as helpers, as caring professionals, because it's part of our identity. It's part of who I am to want to support other people. If I get so far into compassion fatigue that I just can't care any longer, not only am I not going to be effective at my work, but I've lost a piece of my identity in that way as well. Burnout can be a little more general. I mean, you can develop burnout in any kind of profession. This is just, you've just done it too much. You're just exhausted. You've just worked too much or faced too many demands or not had enough support or all of these factors. So, I mean, I think that's pretty basic. And certainly, all of these can be pretty intertwined with each other. So what do we do about these to keep us on the compassion satisfaction side of the continuum? We need to practice self-care beyond lip service. So these are some of the common barriers of why we don't do it. We all know we should be doing it, but often we're not. people who just don't have enough experience or enough training often don't recognize the significance or the need for it. So, you know, I just think about the sort of early career counselor or social worker, or name your profession, where they think they're going to get out there and save the world, and they're available 24/7, and they're going to do whatever they can, and they very quickly just exhaust themselves. So it's always been notable to me that the people who have survived in those careers the longest are also the ones who take self-care the most seriously. I don't think that's a coincidence. Then I really like this point about this myth of professional immunity, this point that, you know, I'm a helper, I'm a caregiver, so I take care of other people. I don't need anyone to take care of me. I don't even need to take care of myself, because I exist to serve others, and somehow having taken a course or gone to school or whatever means I'm immune to these stressors. Absolutely not true. Totally not true. Then some of it is more kind of how you think you're going to be perceived by other people if you talk about this. So this idea of negative self-talk, I'll come back to that in a minute in the stress inoculation section, but that little voice in your head that's saying, well, everyone else seems to be doing okay, so why am I not? I must be weak or incompetent. And of course that means I can't acknowledge that, because then they'll recognize I'm not up to this, and I'll get fired, or I won't get promoted, or whatever. So it's that kind of combination of the stigma of what you expect to hear from other people with the negative self-talk that's coming out of your own brain. So these are all just things to be conscious of for yourself. You know, how many of these are what are getting in the way of you practicing self-care? And I recognize also sometimes it's just simply time, you know, time, availability of resources, all of that kind of stuff. So but some of these are a little more self-imposed, and you might be able to overcome them more easily. So what can we do about these? I always joke this is the mandatory beautiful pile of rocks on a beach image that you have to include when you're talking about mindfulness. But I would give a lot to be on that beach right now looking at that pile of rocks in person. So not a bad image to include in here anyway. But so these are some of the things that are often recommended when we talk about self-care practices. So mindfulness, so that can just be that, you know, just being aware of what you're going through. Often that's interconnected with meditation practices and relaxation practices. These are great skills to cultivate, because these are great ways to just kind of catch what you're going through, help yourself identify why you're feeling the way you're feeling. You know, oh, I'm having a stress reaction when I, you know, am hyperventilating and feeling like the world is crashing down on me. So it's a great way to just sort of catch that reaction and do something very simple about it. These are practices that don't need any supplies. You know, you don't need to go to a gym to do them. Often once you get good at them, you can do them pretty quickly while you're hiding in the bathroom from your kids or whatever your moment of quiet might be. So very wonderful practices, but they're called practices for a reason, because for most people, it's not something you can just suddenly start doing effectively. You often need to kind of, maybe some people can. I am not one of those people, that's for sure. But you need to kind of build up to these and ideally start them under calmer times, so you have those muscles essentially built up to be ready to activate when you are in a more intense period of distress. So great to do. Certainly want to encourage those. Also, for a lot of people, more behavior-based strategies are great. You know, lots and lots of people need their yoga class or their run or their trip to the gym or whatever. And that's wonderful, because of course, then, you know, you're taking care of your body, which then benefits your overall health. And then also that benefits your emotional health as well. So awesome practices. This is another area where I know so many people are not able to do what they normally do in this regard, especially people who are in more urban environments, you know, rely on going to gyms or things like that. So also wonderful, but also not possible for some people at this moment, but great things to cultivate. Less recognized or less widely addressed as forms of self-care are these more cognitive approaches to managing stress. And, you know, it might seem almost weird to think of these as self-care strategies, but to me, if what is causing your stress is the way that you are thinking about a situation, and you can change the way you're thinking about that situation, that will reduce your stress, and therefore it's a form of self-care. So again, there's that self-talk, this idea of kind of what is going on in your mind, what's that narration. I'll return to that in a second. Cognitive restructuring, that kind of goes back to what I was talking about before with different forms of guilt people are feeling that maybe are distorted or inaccurate, or, you know, when we're stressed, we often get into this kind of all or nothing thinking, this kind of catastrophizing. And so what can we do to kind of catch that and revisit that and change the way that we're thinking about something? So that's what I'm going to talk about now with stress inoculation. I will just add a editorial comment on this particular image, which a colleague of mine selected, but I like it. I know these are supposed to be like cogs in your brain, but to me, it's like the hamster wheel that's going on in my brain at 3 in the morning when I'm not practicing this stuff effectively. So this is what we want to be addressing. So stress inoculation is my favorite thing almost in the world right now. It is something that I sort of started training myself to do, I don't know, a year or so ago. And it's now habitual for me, the way that mindfulness becomes habitual for people who are good at that approach to things. So I hope you'll find this useful. I find not many people have actually been exposed to this, but this is what I'll kind of talk about for the rest of this presentation. So stress inoculation, it's particularly appropriate, even though it's coincidental, but you know, the name of it comes from the idea of a vaccination, essentially, of taking a small controlled dose of stress in advance to then activate your mental antibodies to that stressor that you're exposing yourself to, so then you have a milder reaction when you're actually confronting the stress in real life. So very much like a vaccine model. If only we had a vaccine for COVID-19, we wouldn't need any of this, but maybe this will, you know, fill in that gap for a little while. So the basic premise of stress inoculation is that we're starting by recognizing that a situation is going to include stress. Now, often we're thinking about this in terms of a particular new experience we're moving into, but it can apply to those more kind of chronic stressors as well. So it begins by acknowledging we're going to be encountering stress because we're dealing with a situation that we're not quite sure how to deal with or we haven't dealt with in the past. So we start by saying, yes, stress will be involved in this. We cannot fully get rid of that stress, but we can do a lot to be prepared for it. And by doing that, it helps you first kind of acknowledge that this is likely to impact you. So you're not blindsided by it, or you're not in denial about it, which is not going to be effective for sure. It helps you manage your expectations. It helps you kind of go into that stressful situation, not with that all or nothing thinking of, I have to be perfect or I have failed, but what is going to be good enough in this? What is the best you can hope for yourself? And then what can you be doing to try and improve that in the future? What is the intensity? How am I going to get myself ready for what that intensity might be so I don't feel overwhelmed by it when I'm actually in that situation? And then above all, it really comes down to this kind of mental dress rehearsal for what you might be going into or what you might encounter and how you're going to deal with it. So again, that inoculation, you know, you give yourself a controlled dose of the upcoming stress so you're better equipped to deal with it when it actually occurs. So it involves these key elements or components or steps. The first 3 are the real core ones. The fourth one might be useful for supervisors, for managers, and I'll talk about that at the very end. But the first 3 are really the ones that most people are going to focus on. So we're going to identify the stressors, we're going to appraise or evaluate them, and then most importantly, we're going to identify how we are going to cope with them using problem-focused or emotion-focused strategies. So the first step is basically to think through what it is that you might be encountering in this situation. So this is this kind of, okay, what about this is causing me stress? You know, we say here sight, sounds, and smells. I mean, that could be the case for many kind of work-related stressors or things like that. Or if you're visiting, I don't know, well, you can't visit someone in a hospital now, but you know, any kind of, if you're going into an environment that is not typical or not predictable, what is just the stimuli that you might encounter there? That's particularly important when we train disaster responders, but you know, this might be relevant here as well. Is it that you are concerned that you're going to be encountering people's distress? And that could be people who are very sad, who are very upset and emotional, which a lot of us have a hard time dealing with, or that could be people who are very angry. And I suspect as we're coming out of this situation and starting to re-engage with the public, and maybe you guys are already encountering this, dealing remotely with your patrons, you know, we're going to get a lot of that. A lot of people who are very upset and very distressed, and a lot of people who are very pissed off about the situation. So that can be very threatening, and we need to figure out ways to kind of cope with that. It could simply be, I don't feel up to this. I know this is going to be a new situation, and I don't feel equipped to deal with it. And then, of course, for all of us right now, just that kind of broader dread or anxiety or uncertainty about what the future is going to bring. So you want to start by identifying what the specific stressors are that are bothering you. And I think you can just do this at a gut level. Okay, so a simple kind of low stakes example of this is me doing this presentation. I've done lots and lots of trainings and teaching in classrooms and things like that. I'm a pretty comfortable presenter in general, but with all of this switch to webinars, I've had to learn a whole bunch of new technology platforms. And so for me, the thing that was like, oh, the 3 o'clock hamster wheel was not so much, am I going to be able to say what I want to say? It was, am I going to blow the technology in some way? So, you know, you can kind of just follow your instinct about what it is that's bothering you. Some aspects of something that another person might find very difficult might be a piece of cake for you, and vice versa. So what is it for you personally that you're concerned about? Then the next step is, so you've identified those stressors. And for each of those stressors, what you want to do is think about how you are thinking about them. So your kind of meta-analysis of what is it, how are you viewing those particular stressors? And it basically boils down to, are you viewing this as a threat or are you viewing it as a challenge? Pretty sure you can all guess which is the way we want to be viewing these things, obviously. Not as a threat, but just by nature, if something is causing us stress, it's likely that it's because we are just kind of instinctively or at that gut level thinking this is a threat that I'm not going to be able to handle. So the problem with that is that when we are viewing something as a threat, basically what we do is we just clutch, you know, we sort of narrow down our coping resources, our creativity, our ability to look for solutions or to look for other ways of approaching a situation or handling it. And so we get that kind of tunnel vision where, oh my God, I'm not gonna be able to handle this. I'm gonna fail. This is awful. I can't do this. You stop being able to see all the other resources that you have out there. And unfortunately, of course, what's very likely is that it often becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're going in there with that voice in your head saying you're not going to be able to do this, chances are you might not be able to do it. So what you want to do at this stage is recognize, okay, I'm seeing this as a threat. You know, here's the little voice in my head. Why am I seeing this as a threat? How can I recast that to instead talk myself into seeing it as a challenge? Because when we see something as a challenge, you know, we're placing it back in the eustress category rather than the distress category. That is when we think creatively, we look for other solutions, we break it down, we make a plan, and the voice in our head at that point is saying, okay, you can handle this, you can do this. So that is kind of what you want to talk yourself into. And often, I mean, it's a kind of fake it till you make it thing. You know, keep repeating the positive script in your head, talk yourself into it, which I know can sound impossible, but it can be done. And then what you want to do now that you're viewing it as a challenge is figure out what is under your control and what is not under your control. So what can you do to actually change the source of the stress? And if not, if it's something you legitimately can't change, how are you going to handle that? So here's where I always like to talk about this idea or this analogy of, when we're viewing something as a threat, it's a brick wall. Here's me, here's what I need to do out there. There's a brick wall between me and my confidence or my belief that I'm able to handle it. So what you're doing in that kind of self-talk is starting by trying to break it down. You can't get rid of the brick wall entirely, right? I mean, that's our basic premise of stress inoculation. That is legit stress that is still going to be there. But maybe by approaching it more creatively and in a more positive way, instead of a solid brick wall that's blocking my view, I can boil it down into a bunch of piles of bricks. Now, I still need to deal with each of those piles of bricks, right? But I can see a path through them, and a pile of brick is a lot more manageable than something that is just blinding you to everything. Okay, so I hope that analogy makes sense. Here's how you start to then do that. Okay, so our next step is figuring out, okay, broken it down into those piles of bricks, and now let me analyze each one of them to figure out, is this something that is under my control? And if so, what can I do to tackle that pile? Because in some cases, you might be able to get rid of that pile entirely. So going back to my low stakes analogy, I was unconfident using the technology for webcasts to begin with. So before each of them that I've done on a new platform, I have worked with the hosts or the sponsors to do a run through. So we did this yesterday with Carolyn and Tessa, and we practiced using this new medium. So in that case, it took some, I did skill development for this one. I sought out people, Zachary in tech support, who could help do the training. So it's, it's reaching out, it's figuring out what do you need, who in your world can help you with that, so that you can take away as many of those bricks as possible. All right, so that's great. I mean, that kind of problem-focused strategy is the ideal because it can help us actually eliminate some of the kinds of stress. It's also very important to recognize some of those kinds of stress we are just not going to be able to deal with. So what are you going to do about the things that you cannot change? This is totally the serenity prayer. Give me the wisdom to change the things I can, accept the things I can't, and wisdom to know the difference. I never get that exactly right, but I mean, that's basically what we're looking at. This is the part about handling the things that you can't change. So this is where you're going to use your more emotion-focused strategies. So that could be those things like mindfulness and breathing techniques. That can be great. I think this distress tolerance is one that we all should be practicing a little bit more right now, kind of acknowledging, this situation with the pandemic is awful and we're not going to feel great for a while. And we kind of have to learn to be okay with that, or learning a new skill, or recognizing the limits of what you may be able to do for your patrons or something. Just figuring out how you're going to be okay with these feelings, acknowledging these are not pleasant feelings, but what can you do to kind of handle them? Same thing with emotion regulation and anger management. When you reach that boiling point, how can you bring that down so that you are coping with it in a healthier way that's not spiking your blood pressure or causing you to lash out at other people and then increasing their distress? And I'm a huge fan of distraction. Take a break and watch a puppy video on your phone, or, open up the window and get a breath of fresh air if that's an option for you. Or again, hide in the bathroom for a minute and just breathe. Also, limit your media exposure. You do not need to be watching the news or tracking news on your phone 24/7. Take a break. Watch your favorite 80s sitcom, dance to your favorite silly song, whatever, do a TikTok, whatever it is. That is not denial. That is not avoidance. That is giving yourself the mental space to recognize that the world is not entirely pandemic and stress. We need that. We absolutely need that. Okay, so those are the more emotion-focused strategies. And I hope I kind of explained that clearly enough, but this is the part where you can't change the stress in these areas. So what are you going to do about it so that you can handle that stress more effectively? And then finally, just very briefly, this point about for supervisors, if you can make policy changes, if you can make structural changes, if you can make sure that, I don't know, your staff members have the technology they need to be able to do their jobs, or you can set a policy that people are not on call after normal work hours or whatever, or even just doing stress inoculation with your staff so that as they're preparing, say, to re-engage with patrons in person or something like that, they go through this exercise and they have these skills. That's a great way of applying this. All right, at 3:01, pretty good time-wise. So this is basically my last slide before we'll get into questions. So if you have questions, this is a great time to start submitting them or continue submitting them. So basically just bringing this all together in one handy chart. I keep thinking I should like tattoo this on my hand so I can just refer to it. I think I've sort of got it internalized enough at the moment, but just to kind of walk yourself through this. So starts with just appraising each stressor. What is it that is bugging you? What is it that is causing you concern about this situation? Are you viewing it as a threat? If so, how can you use that reframing, that positive self-talk, reaching out to others to shift it over into the challenge category? Now it's a challenge. Good job. Is it something you're perceiving as something you can control or change or not? If yes, you're going to use your problem-focused strategies, break it down, break it down, break it down, get the skills you need, reach out to other people, get resources to try and remove those piles of bricks as much as possible. If not, focus on the emotion strategies, figure out what you are going to do with your stress reactions so that you're able to tolerate them, you're able to, hopefully lower your baseline to some degree. And that is going to help you be much more effective in kind of every part of your life, professional and personal. So that is stress inoculation. I hope you guys find that as helpful as I personally have found it. And I will, at this point, hand it over for questions or comments. Carolyn, I know you're going to come. Yeah, great.
Hi. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Karla. This is fantastic. We have had a very, very active chat while you were talking.
Okay.
So what I actually just started taking some notes just to catch you up on with some of the conversation that was going on while you were presenting. And I just want to, I dropped this in the chat. I just want to say a couple people have to leave because they have another appointment at 3. But if you can stay, we've got 30 more minutes for Q&A. So if you have some questions, feel free to put them in now. And Karla, if you don't mind, I'll catch you up on some of the conversation. Just first, a lot of logistics questions. We are recording, so the recording will be made available to you. And Karla, I'm assuming we can also share slides. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Okay, great. And anyone who needs a CE certificate, I'll drop the link again. You can request your CE certificate. So a couple of things that people were talking about, like this is very random from the chat, but like they love the name quarantine brain. That was a term that put, term to the stressor. And the validation of that was fantastic. People are feeling stress from burying themselves in work, like even on the weekends. It's been getting a little bit better with the weather, but people are checking email, they're reading, they're watching webinars, and it's very hard to have a work mindset at home. Distractions from home are causing stress. And Karla, I know you mentioned our run through yesterday that was completely Zoom bombed by my toddlers. So yeah, I hear that. People have been missing things like important life things, like someone missed the birth of a grandchild, and you mentioned it in the chat. And people are feeling stress from learning new technology and providing virtual services. And just much like these notes, people's ADHD is in full swing, and like feeling the accountability. As far as very librarian specific things, people are missing taking care of their patrons. It's a social connection that goes both ways. And there was one really poignant note that one person in the chat mentioned that they had been watching webinars that were created before the pandemic that were all about the importance of making one-on-one connections with patrons. And it's now anxiety inducing to watch those webinars that talk about the one-on-one connections. And, people miss hugs and in-person story time. People are worried about the elderly. There's you almost get like a dopamine rush when you help people. And then there was a lot of chat about hearing from supervisors because some people are getting phone calls from supervisors, and that is supportive. On the other hand, the supervisors are also under a lot of stress. There's one person here who has been thrust into the position of acting director and has to go to the library all by themselves and is doing a lot more work than usual and being in this big empty library. So people want to hear from their coworkers and their bosses, but on the other hand, everybody is busy. There's a lot of people who are balancing the children, the daycare, the homeschooling, and the uncertainty about what to do if there's no school or daycare and we have to go back to work. So a lot of uncertainty is a big topic here. And you know, people have been helped by the Calm app and, you know, stop, think, and pause. But there's just this also anxiety about going back to work and from the safety, the health and safety perspective, and also figuring out like, where were we? Like, what were we doing on March 13th? And what are my passwords? I like that. That was very specific. Like I'm like, yeah, I went into our office one time and I was like, oh my God, what's the code? What's the alarm code? Oh no, like the police are going to get called. So I don't remember how to do this. And it feels like going back is not going to be the same. So, and I feel I'm seeing in my, the corner of my eye, a lot of more chat coming in. But Karla, can you see the Q&A?
Let me see. Okay.
And I'm going to say, answer the recording.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. I see one thing for me, the evaluation doesn't have permission. I'm going to go in and change the permissions for the evaluation. But the rest are for you if you want to take a look at those.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, so I'll just go through in order, I guess. So, and again, some of these I might not have great answers for, but I'll kick them back. And it's good to at least see that these are questions people are talking about, like what came up in the chat for sure. Yeah. So the first one, and I don't know if everyone can everyone see the questions on, or should I read them out?
They might be able to see them, but they won't be in the recording. So if you read them out, that will help for the future recording. Okay.
So this is from, I guess some of them are anonymous, so I'll skip names, but so I noticed with my IBS illness, stress causes flare-ups to this illness for sure. I hope you will discuss ways of decreasing stress. I hope it looks like that came pretty early in the presentation. So I hope I've provided some of those. But I think, absolutely recognizing what is likely to cause a flare-up and trying, I think again, the stress inoculation, setting those boundaries, doing whatever you can to take care of yourself physically. It's kind of a tough one because it's so specific, but I think even for people without a pre-existing physical condition, the stress is very real as well. But I think for sure for people who already have something like that, it's even compounded. So don't have a great answer on that one, but I hope, some of the stuff I talked about throughout the presentation, I hope we'll just address that in general. Next one, for those of us already dealing with anxiety, how can we halt or derail the kind of catastrophic thinking that can accompany mental rehearsal of stressful situations as advised in stress inoculation? Yeah, that's a great question. I think, doing it gradually and maybe for a limited period of time, kind of easing yourself into it. I mean, it's almost like thinking about, I'm blanking on the name of the cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's like progressive exposure to something, maybe just like tiptoe into what is stressing you out, think about it. Even, you could literally set a timer. You could have, oh, this is my worry time. I'm going to think about this issue for 5 minutes or for 1 minute, if that's all you can tolerate to begin with. But it's sort of this ironic thing because it's through thinking about it that you're going to be able to figure out strategies to deal with it. But I get completely that even just thinking about it can trigger that kind of anxiety. So I would say, first of all, doing what you can, like if you do any kind of mindfulness practice, especially for someone with general anxiety, great thing to cultivate so that you have breathing exercises and habits you can fall into. So get yourself into as calm a state as possible then try to think about the stressor so that you can start to plan and kind of reduce it. So it's probably my best advice, but yeah, I mean, not easy, but I think, you know, it's starting from as calm a situation as possible might be helpful in some way. What are some good apps or books to help with yoga and meditation? I don't know of any personally offhand, but I know there are tons out there. So maybe that's something other people have recommendations for. I mean, I know there are millions of them out there. Sorry, I don't have specific recommendations, but if others maybe want to post their favorites in the chat, maybe people can access them that way.
A lot of people are saying Headspace, Down Dog, and Calm app.
Okay, Headspace, Down Dog, and Calm app. Those sound good. So start with those. How do you deal with stress eating? I've always struggled with this. Yeah, and especially for people who are now at home, you know, working in the kitchen or, you know, steps away from the refrigerator. That is absolutely going to be, you know, an increased, I don't know, risk factor. There again, probably mindfulness. I mean, just sort of catching yourself. You know, why, if your go-to when you're feeling stressed is stress eating or certainly stress drinking. I mean, I think there's a lot of people who are drinking a lot more alcohol right now than they normally would and probably should be doing. I will cop to that myself on occasion. Just kind of catching yourself. So like, okay, why am I heading for the refrigerator? And is that what's going to actually help me feel less calm? Or is it something else that I need to deal with? Again, not a great answer, but just kind of catching yourself and breaking that cycle or that habitual response of that's the only thing you know to reach for stress. So instead, are there other forms of stress reduction that might be more effective? And that's, I say effective because the stress eating might help you feel better temporarily, but it doesn't help you function better. And that's what we're really looking for in terms of effective coping mechanisms. That's something my colleague is going to talk about a lot more in the training on psychological first aid in 2 weeks. So I would definitely recommend checking that one out. Okay, oh boy, how do you manage guilt if you think you have infected someone who has died? Oof, that's a brutal situation to be in. I mean, I think just recognizing that, you know, of course you're going to feel guilt about that, but you did not do it intentionally for sure. You did it, and maybe this is not you, hopefully, but how does one manage that? You know, we didn't know, we just didn't know at the beginning. And so I don't think anyone has intentionally infected anyone else. You know, this is very parallel, I think, to what comes up often in more traditional disasters where someone might receive a warning that they need to evacuate or something, and then they don't, and then there are bad consequences, and then they punish themselves deeply because it's that sense of, if only I had listened. But they made that decision based on the best information they had at the time. And so recognizing, you know, did you know this was a risk factor when you had that contact with someone? Can you be sure that you're the one who infected them? I mean, you probably can't be. So just thinking through how realistic is that guilt or that fear, and some of it may be realistic, unfortunately, but that's where you need to have those more emotion-focused strategies to figure out, can you forgive yourself for that? But yeah, that's a really rough one. And something like that might be something where some professional mental health support could be very useful. Okay. I have found a routine helps. Get up at the same time, take a long walk, make phone calls, write letters instead of texting, etc. Yeah, that is great advice. You know, keep to some level of routine and habit, and that includes just self-care in those practical terms. Showering every day or every other day. That's a good thing to do. Every other day is my goal these days. But yeah, and that ties into kind of what I said earlier about, you know, setting boundaries. You know, have a routine, but if possible, have part of that routine be that you are available for responses from, you know, 9 to 5 or whatever a normal work shift might be. And after that, you might not be available, or maybe you set a schedule where, you know, you check your email once in the evening. I got an email response from someone, we're talking about another training, which I thought was awesome. It wasn't like an out of office response. It was just her automated email response to everything saying, I am home working with 2 toddlers, and therefore I am probably not going to be able to respond to your email right away. That was great. It's setting expectations and setting limits that we are not all on, we're not 911 operators, we shouldn't be on call constantly. So that kind of is another aspect of this idea of a routine, but part of that routine needs to be, when are you not working? I'm doing my best to not work on Saturdays. I'm working on Sundays, I'm working every other day, I'm working longer hours than I would like to be, but I'm trying to sort of carve out Saturday as the day that I'm in my garden or doing something, I'm still monitoring email, but I'm trying not to respond to it. So I think that's great advice. Okay, I have a question, or really a request for recommendations. We have staff meetings on Zoom, and it's hard to know how best to assist staff to deal with their stress about uncertainty of when we reopen and what it will be like. Endless discussion of what we don't know. Does that help people? They ask for these meetings, but it's hard for me to understand how it's helpful. Yeah, I have seen this in my own work environment. I'm a professor at SUNY New Paltz, along with my work at the Institute for Disaster Mental Health. And, there's a lot of questions among the faculty there about, are classes going to start up again in the fall? And are they going to be hybrid or remote or whatever? And part of what has been odd to me is that people are getting into these discussions with this kind of perspective that they're going to have choice in the matter. And they're really not. These are going to be policies for most people. I mean, if you're a supervisor, maybe you'll have some say in that. But I think that limiting that kind of constant discussion, we've been officially, I think my administration is doing a great job handling all of this, but they've informed us and everyone at SUNY, there's like 4 different contingency policies in place for the fall semester. To me, it is not helpful now, 2 or 3 months out, to even be thinking about that. I mean, just this idea of sort of taking it one day at a time. For a while we were talking about this is the new normal and how do we adapt to that. I've tried to stop even using that term. There is no normal. We don't know when there's going to be a normal. This is the now. What can we do to deal with the now? I think, maybe reassuring people that supervisors are thinking about this and will do it in as supportive a manner as possible. Maybe that would be helpful. But to me, it's a form of sort of rumination or just like fixing on trying to come up with answers that are unanswerable at this point. So that might be another area where just kind of getting people to scale back, say, look, we will inform you as soon as we can. But for now, let's just focus on doing the best we possibly can under these circumstances. It's not going to satisfy everyone. Some people need to know what's out there in the future, but at least kind of in staff meetings, maybe limiting endless discussion about things that are unanswerable. Hope that helps a little bit. Could you show the identify organizational strategy slide again? Should I do that, Carolyn, or people are going to get the, okay, sure. Let me, whoops, nope. Okay. Can everyone see that, or is the Q&A is in the way? Wait, how's that?
Yeah, you're just seeing on your screen, but everybody can move the Q&A to their own spot.
Oh, okay.
So, but yeah, if you want to leave it there for a second, sure.
Sure.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, I think on this, I didn't touch on it when I was speaking earlier, but this kind of goes back to what I was just saying, providing realistic preparation to help staff know what they're in for. Well, some of the realistic preparation right now is that we don't know, and that's difficult. So that goes back again to that kind of tolerance of uncertainty, which is really not easy. I do think the last point, I probably should have emphasized this as well, but this idea of essential and non-essential tasks, or rotating through, maybe if it's something where someone in your library or your department, I don't know exactly how this might work in a library setting, but you might get an emergency call, but can you schedule it so that there's one person on call each evening to respond to those and everyone else is officially off during that time? Anything like that to just sort of compartmentalize or bracket people's expectations or responsibilities, I think could be useful to just genuinely think, okay, I'm off duty right now. I am not supposed to be checking my email or my text. Someone else is doing that. People are not being left in the lurch, but it is not my turn. And then I'll take my turn happily because I've had a chance to recharge when it wasn't my turn. Okay, let me, oops, now I've lost my, wait, let me get back to the Q&A. Okay, how should we approach patrons who are in distress from the COVID outbreak? Compassionately, patiently. Again, I don't want to like put this off for 2 weeks, so I'll attempt to address this now, but this definitely attend the psychological first aid because that will give you some more kind of skills with this. I think, you know, a lot of what people are going through, the patrons, I'm sure, it's the same stressors that you guys are all going through. It's the uncertainty, it's the being pulled in a million different directions, and now it's without the comfort of the library that maybe was their sort of second home or place where they felt welcomed and supported. So, I mean, I think a lot of it is often just listening empathetically. Often what people need to do is just talk about what they're going through, especially people who are isolated, who don't have another support system. So that might mean spending, you know, 20 minutes or a half hour on the phone, just letting someone talk about what's upsetting them and what they're missing from normal life and all of that. It can be hard to do that. You want to be doing that in a way that is empathetic so that you're showing them you understand what they're going through, but this is really important, and my colleague will talk about this. You need to not be sympathetic where you're actually feeling it with them. You need to have a kind of boundary so that you are not taking on their emotions. We often use the phrase in disaster mental health, their pain is not my pain. Their suffering is not my suffering. I can try and help them with their suffering, but I need to do that without taking it on, because that is a sure road to compassion fatigue and burnout and secondary stress. So it's a really hard question to give a brief answer to, but I think, you know, start with that listening, you know, create an opening for someone to talk about what they're going through. Now, I should say, we also recognize we don't ever want to push people to talk about their experiences or about their stress if they're not ready to. Some people have a more avoidant style, or they're so busy just trying to get through the next day that they can't open up that kind of can of emotional worms. So if you do, you know, if someone doesn't want to talk about it, you want to respect that, but you want to kind of set it up so that they feel it's comfortable. I also would absolutely say, and Carolyn, maybe this is something you can help with, is making sure people know what resources are. If you're talking to someone and they're clearly really in distress and they need to talk to someone else, a mental health professional, knowing how to make those referrals is really key. So, you know, hopefully all of you are aware of, within your own communities, what resources might be available through like mental health associations or other organizations. For anyone, you can recommend the Disaster Distress Helpline, which is a 24/7 number that people can either call or text. They also provide services in Spanish and I think a number of other languages. They do a really, really good job just of taking kind of crisis calls and just kind of helping people feel supported and calm down a little bit. So maybe that's a resource we can share with people. But again, attend the psychological first aid. You'll get more skills on this for sure. Okay, do you know of resources to help people who live alone and are especially stressed by isolation during the pandemic? I usually meet friends, go to stores or movies, but these strategies aren't really available anymore. Yeah, a lot of people are going through that. I mean, especially a lot of older people, especially a lot of people who aren't comfortable with the technology or don't have access to that, which is especially unfortunate. I'm not sure of like specific resources, but just encouraging people to reach out to whatever form of social support is working. You know, the virtual happye hour or the virtual book club or things like that. If you have the access, and I mean, the technology for this can be the telephone. There's been like such a re-emergence of the value of the plain old phone for people, which is great. But I think often people sort of get into this habit or this self-reinforcing pattern of self-isolating. So really pushing yourself or encouraging other people to reach out, to make a plan, to, you know, even if it's like, okay, once a day, I'm gonna call somebody, or I'm going to join an online community or something like that. Kind of goes back to the idea of a habit, so that you don't sort of slide into that, I'm just alone with, you know, nothing but Netflix or whatever to keep me company. So I don't know, again, if other people have suggestions on that, that would be great. I'm gonna keep going to try and get through the last few. How can we be supportive of coworkers who are anxious to get back to work? Yeah, this is a real divide. Clearly, some people really want to get back out there and some people really don't. And so I understand that can be a real source of conflict for people. So, I mean, I think trying to be understanding of each other's perspectives, maybe. I mean, I think we get into this, we were talking about this earlier in the pandemic, this kind of conflict between the camp of why are you freaking out versus why are you not freaking out? And people, you know, we just kind of get shut into our own perspectives. So have a conversation, you know, talk about why do they think that it is safe and appropriate to get back to work? And then why do you have different thoughts or concerns or issues with it? So not necessarily going to solve any conflicts, but at least just kind of not getting over that stance of, well, you don't agree with me, therefore you're an idiot, which both people are probably feeling. So trying to understand the perspectives on both sides. So that might help a little bit. Okay, there are lots of yoga videos and books on Hoopla if your library provides this services. And you probably all know if your library provides this service. So great, another good tip, thank you. Great question. Is napping during the day a sign of stress? Yeah, or it's a sign that you have the opportunity to take a nap during the day. You know, I think a lot of us probably are not sleeping great at night. So if you need a nap to supplement that during the day, or you just have the opportunity to nap, napping's awesome. If you are one of those people who can do it and then get refreshed and recharged from it and get up and go back to whatever you need to do, that's a good type of napping. If that means that you are spending your entire day on the couch, sleeping and avoiding the world, not a healthy sign of napping. So, you know, it's not the nap itself, it's kind of what's motivating the nap. So if you can do it in a healthy way, awesome, you know, take advantage of this, because once we're all back to work in a normal way, we're not gonna be able to do that. But keep an eye on it. Keep an eye on any of those habits, like the overeating or over drinking, anything that is becoming a habit that you're turning to rather than a healthier form of coping. Okay, how should we embrace new normal after going back to work? How can we train ourselves to be stress-free? That's the billion-dollar question. I don't have a good answer to that because we don't know when that's going to happen. You know, we don't know how long it's going to be. We don't know if we're going to have the experience of starting to open things up again and having a second wave, which then is going to make people even more anxious about getting, you know, coming back to this kind of retreating and then being even more fearful when it happens again. So I and my colleagues in the psychology world are trying to figure out what is going to be needed and what that behavior is going to look like for people. But that's another area where I think we just don't know. I am a very, very big believer in science. You know, for me, when the CDC says that it's safe and appropriate to go outside, maybe using continuing measures like face masks or limited social distancing or something like that, I'm going to believe that largely. I mean, I might still have some trepidation that I have to kind of talk myself out of, but I have faith in the science, not necessarily in elected officials always, but that might be a source of comfort for some people. Some people, you know, people are going to get back out there at different paces, and, you know, that's fine. But I think we need to not turn into a nation of agoraphobes who are afraid to re-engage once things really are reestablished as safe, whatever that's going to look like. Okay, what are best practices to turn to when you wake up at 3 a.m. realizing you're dreaming of and are worried about work? Wish I had an answer for that. That's my life right now. As a lifelong insomniac, this is, yeah, I'm certainly dealing with that right now myself. I think just trying to sort of talk yourself down from it, calm yourself down, compartmentalize again. And, you know, can you actually do something about this right now? Probably not. So, you know, maybe it is a point where start keeping a pen and paper next to your bed and jot yourself a note. Had this concern in the middle of the night. I'm going to think about this during the day tomorrow and see if there's an answer to it. You know, just trying to kind of calm down the hamsters in your brain, calm down that spiral, which is not easy to do at 3 o'clock in the morning again. And, you know, all the usual stuff about good sleep hygiene, always important, but not necessarily sufficient right now. Carolyn, should I keep going? It looks like they're still coming.
Well, we're at the scheduled end. And I'm just looking, I mean, I think maybe if you just want to pick one or two more, because I know some people do have to leave. I don't want to respect the people that need to leave. But if you wanted to just look through and, you know, and pick one or two more questions that maybe like a good ender that could summarize them.
Okay. Yeah.
And wrap up.
Okay. Yeah. I'm seeing one here. Okay. Well, just very briefly, the one about someone who forgets to eat because you get so involved in work. Set an alarm to remind you. I mean, you know, don't count on your instincts, but, you know, because it's not good to not eat. You know, then you get low blood sugar and then everything else gets compounded. So set yourself an alarm, have a snack. That one's good. Last one I'll do, this is such a good question, is going back to work in the library a threat or a challenge? Let me actually get back to, whoops. So is it a threat or a challenge? That is an awesome question. I certainly do not have an answer for that. I think so much of it is going to depend on the timing of when this happens, the official policies for while this all gets rolled out, the training, the support everyone gets. But I mean, I think ultimately everyone's going to need to decide for themselves. You know, if you are viewing this as a threat that is causing you so much anxiety that it is just not healthy or appropriate for you to go back to work, maybe you need to, I don't know, think about a different job or something like that. I know in this economy, that's not a lot of opportunities there, but you know, what can you do to use those reframing methods if you are viewing it as a threat? And I'm sure everyone's going to have some elements that they are viewing as a threat. But you know, if you can, you know, all these points, remember your strengths, you know, hopefully all the supervisors are going to do everything they possibly can to provide the support and the training and the whatever physical equipment might be necessary. And communications is such a huge part of this, as I said earlier, you know, communicating to staff members what to expect, communicating to the patrons what to expect and what the policies and procedures are going to be. You know, I think we're all going to need to push ourselves. I don't think anyone is going to find it simple or unstressful to have that return when we finally do, whether that's to your library or for me to my campus or other people to their stores or businesses, whatever. But we're going to have to do it. I mean, I don't think anyone wants to live in a society where we're living in permanent conditions of social distancing. So it's going to be stressful. You know, let's use stress inoculation. Let's acknowledge it's going to be stressful, but let's figure out how to manage the stressors and manage our own emotions around them so that we can ultimately start living our lives again in the way we want to. So I think that's an ending point, maybe.
Muted. Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm dropping the links one last time for the evaluation and the CE request form and psychological first aid. Just wanted to say thank you for everyone who stayed and who joined us today. I will send you all an email with the recording and the notes. And Karla, thank you so much for your time and your expertise in this.
My pleasure. Thank you all for the work you're doing. Seriously, huge fan. So yeah, I look forward to being back in your libraries in person before too long.
Let's do. All right. Be well, everyone. We'll see you soon.